Academic staff from 36 departments are present today. Such is the drawing power of Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor of Linguistics at MIT. The Journalism Department is proud to host Noam and Carol Chomsky, a visit made possible by the Foundation for Peace Studies Aotearoa, New Zealand, where put on stage by Kate Hughes. Professor Chomsky is in New Zealand primarily to present the Media Peace Awards organised by the Foundation in Auckland tonight. The Journalism Department has convened judging of the print section of these awards since 1987, and it is this long association with the Foundation which opened the way for Professor Chomsky's whistle-stop visit to Christchurch today. Noam Chomsky is someone for whom the cliché "needs no introduction" is absolutely appropriate. Put briefly, he transformed the study of linguistics in the 1960s and subsequently influenced many disciplines, including psychology and education, changing our ideas about the human capacity for language and the workings of the mind. Turning his formidable intellect to an analysis of the wider structures of society, he argued that the ideals of democracy are subverted by small, powerful groups. In his widely acclaimed book, Manufacturing Consent, co-written with Edward Herman, he developed the propaganda model to describe the structural features of the mass media which make them susceptible to co-option by powerful interests. So much more could be said, but let me simply call on Professor Noam Chomsky to address the topic, Whose World Order? Conflicting Visions. Professor Chomsky.
Well, I have to apologize that it is a whistle-stop visit and very brief. I'm in the midst of a intense series of talks around the world. One of the frustrations of talks, I don't know how many thousands I've given over the years, but it's always the same, is that the discussion, which is always much more interesting for me and for the audience, is usually curtailed. I try to discipline myself to keep the talk short and the discussion long, so as to minimize that problem, and given the shortness of time today, I will definitely try. Actually, I'll just mention, really, a series of topics, and maybe we can pick them up and pursue them as you'd be interested. Also, again, for reasons of shortness of time, I'm going to concentrate primarily on the United States, for one reason, because that's what I know, but it's not an inappropriate choice. It's been the overwhelmingly decisive factor in world affairs in the last half-century. Remains far and away the richest and most powerful country in the world. It also has long, stable, and democratic institutions by comparative standards, and is as good a model as there is of state capitalist democracy, which is not meant to imply that it's a very good model. Thinking of the future. Well, the record of prediction in human affairs is not overly impressive, bit of an understatement, but it's not an entirely hopeless task. And if we are willing to take a close look, careful look at where we are and how we got there, trying hard to free ourselves from the grip of established doctrine and ideology, then we can get at least, I think, a reasonable grasp of the likely prospects and, more significant, of the options that are available to shape the future along more just and humane directions. In the coming years, there are a number of very serious crises that are likely to loom very large. The term crisis has been used so often that its meaning is somewhat debased, but sometimes it's authentic, and in several cases it really is. One is the crisis of nuclear weapons. It's kind of a miracle that hasn't destroyed human civilization and much of the rest in the last half century, and it takes quite a lot of faith to suppose that miracle will persist. If you look at the focus, New Zealand actually has a stellar record in this regard and is in a strong moral position to lead the way in this task that has to be undertaken to get these monstrous devices eliminated. As long as they exist, life is in very great peril. The focus is generally on proliferation, so India and Pakistan and Iran and so on. But that's to misunderstand the dynamics of nuclear weapons spread, which clearly show that the problem is in the major nuclear states, which have, of course, not lived up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the intent of the Non-Proliferation Treaty was to call for nuclear disarmament. The great powers would not permit that. Nevertheless, there is wording calling for good faith efforts to for the nuclear powers to rid themselves of nuclear weapons, and of course nothing like that has happened, quite the opposite. And if you consider the dynamics of nuclear weapon spread, that guarantees proliferation. So Pakistan has nuclear weapons to defend itself against India, and India has nuclear weapons to defend itself against China, and China had nuclear weapons to defend itself against Russia, and Russia had them because of the interaction with the United States, and it's going to continue that way. Israel has already had them for 20 years. Iran will have them. Iraq will have them the minute inspectors leave, because all it takes is a developed industrial infrastructure to develop nuclear weapons. So you either turn a country into a desert or it's going to be able to develop nuclear weapons. And one can pretty confidently predict the proliferation of these horrors. The more they proliferate, the greater the dangers. And that will continue by the essential dynamics of the process until the rot at the core is eliminated. And at the moment, there are no signs of that, and that's an extremely dangerous situation. The other major crisis that everyone is or ought to be aware of is the environmental crisis, and that could be extremely serious. There is a range of uncertainty about what the consequences are. The business world, which essentially runs the world, has been downplaying the dangers by a very conscious misinterpretation of the uncertainty. It is quite true that there is uncertainty. So models of prediction of climate have a big plus or minus associated with them. And that has been used consistently in business propaganda, meaning the media and so on, to argue that it's unnecessary to take strong steps because there's a range of uncertainty. Maybe the forecasts are overstated. There is a range of uncertainty, but that means that the forecasts may be overstated or they may be understated. That's exactly what uncertainty means. And we don't know. So perhaps the crisis is far more severe than the scientific consensus, or perhaps it's less severe, but minimal prudence and rationality would indicate that strong steps ought to be taken to deal with it in the hope that there's still time, which is not so obvious. But that's a major crisis and cannot be left to, it obviously can't be left to the market. In fact, the whole system indicates a radical market failure. There are many reasons why the market ideology, which is trumpeted here, for example, and not in many other parts of the world, except by force, but here unusually voluntarily. There are many reasons why that model is a fraud and is known to be a fraud. One reason is precisely this. The ones who will pay the costs of the environmental crisis, even in principle, don't have a vote in the marketplace because they're not alive. Well, if you study economics, that's called an externality, meaning sort of like a footnote that you don't have to deal with. But that means that the models are about as realistic as a model of terrestrial, of planetary motion that called the effect of the sun an externality, which we don't have to bother with. We'll continue with the nice model. And of course, that's only one. The cost of oil is simply unrelated to any meaningful market principle. For one thing, because the long-term costs, the externalities, are not calculated at all. but even for narrower reasons. So, for example, a large part of the U.S. Pentagon budget is dedicated to keeping the price of oil within a certain range, not too low because the profits go back to the U.S. energy companies, but not too high because that might be harmful to the U.S. and other industrial economies. So they're enormous. The major U.S. intervention forces have always been poised at the Middle East. That has nothing to do with the Russians. That's now officially conceded and has always been obvious. That's also true of the nuclear weapon system and so on. All of that has to be calculated into the price of oil. In fact, it's not the kind of thing that economists study, at least if they want to get jobs. But there is one technical I know of only one technical study carried out by a Department of Energy consultant in the United States. His estimate is that military expenditures alone amount to about a 30% subsidy to the price of oil, from which he concludes realistically that means that all estimates about the efficiency of trade and anything else are wildly off base for that reason alone. And we can continue on and on. The market ideology is a simple fraud for all sorts of reasons, of which these are some. The environmental crisis is very real. It's tied to, though not limited to, use of hydrocarbons. That, incidentally, is another crisis that is coming along, at least if the general consensus of geologists is anywhere near accurate. The oil is obviously a finite resource. It's been building up for millions of years. It's going to be destroyed in roughly 200 years. There's no alternative known, feasible alternative available, though there might be if enough effort were put into finding them, probably would be. It's not being done. It's an exhaustible resource, and furthermore, the exhaustion may not be very far away. There's a misleading oil glut at the moment, but it's expected to be quite temporary. Oil usage has about 50% of all oil usage has been in the last 20 years since the oil crisis of the early 70s. That led to acceleration of use of oil, as I say, about 50%. Furthermore, the rate of discovery has been going down. It went up from the mid-19th century and straight up until mid-1960s. Since then, it's been going straight down. The chances are that whatever's around is known and is getting harder and harder to get, and most of it, the overwhelming mass of it, is in the Persian Gulf area in the Middle East, as has always been the case. The Caspian Sea is estimated to be roughly the scale of North Sea, small blip on the oil usage. That means that the Middle East will play a more and more central role in world affairs. Efforts to control it by force, by the United States primarily, will continue and in fact escalate. It's a turbulent region, I don't have to tell you. There's a lot of conflicts. The conflicts are going to continue and probably be exacerbated by the growing share of the Persian Gulf region, the Arabian Peninsula Gulf region, in oil production. It's expected that the sort of what's always been regarded as the crucial point is when total known exploitable energy resources are 50% utilized, and that's expected to come in maybe 10 or 20 years, maybe less, and after that we're on the downslide. That's the very usage of oil is itself kind of a human disaster because of the environmental effects. The absence of it will be another kind of disaster, interacting with the presence of nuclear weapons in obvious ways. All of these things interact. So, there are many ominous developments lying ahead. None of them are inevitable. I mean, these are not laws of nature. These are the results of human decisions shaped by ideological considerations in the interests of power sectors. They're not hard to identify. It's commonly argued that the use of oil is the result of basically consumer choice in a market system. So the use of oil, take say the United States, but it generalizes, is primarily automobiles and airplanes, and that's consumer choice, free market, etc. That's more fraud. The use of automobiles and oils and airplanes was a political decision pressed by the major enterprises. By actually, it began, involving enormous social engineering, government social engineering projects, biggest ones in history, I suppose, which completely changed the nature of the United States, and as that pattern's proliferated around the world. Take, say, airplanes. There wouldn't be any airplanes if it wasn't for massive public funding. The aircraft industry has never been self-sustaining. It developed in the 1920s and the 1930s through federal government funding for post office and that sort of thing. In the Second World War, it took off, but that was, of course, state development. Boeing, which now is one of the two companies in the world that monopolizes the commercial jet market. The other is Airbus, also governmental. Boeing is a state company. It's called private. Its profits are private, but it's been developed through government subsidies as a kind of an offshoot of the military system, and aerospace taking off in the Second World War and continuing that way. And furthermore, this is well known. So right after the Second World War, the major business press, Fortune magazine and Business Week, pointed out that the aeronautical industry cannot survive in a competitive free enterprise economy, and the government must be the savior. They extended that to all of high-tech industry, but primarily the airplane industry, which is the biggest U.S. exporter and a source of enormous profits through tourism and so on. But it's fundamentally publicly subsidized and developed at public expense, including the airports and the aircraft design and the jet motors and the rest of it. That's not consumer choice. That's private decisions, clearly made because the industry is non-competitive, could not exist in a free market system, and therefore the government must be the savior, which means the public has to pay for it, leading to a shift to the use of airplanes in favor of other kinds of transport, which would be much more energy intensive, less use of energy for the same purpose, railroads, for example. That's only a part of the story. The same is true of automobiles. Let's take a city like Los Angeles, which I assume some of you have visited. Los Angeles is kind of like a maze of freeways, big highways. You race around all over the place. No public transportation system. That didn't happen through consumer choice. It happened through a literal conspiracy. I don't use the term loosely. This is a conspiracy in the sense that it went to court and led to fines for conspiracy. Three major corporations, General Motors, automobiles, Standard Oil of California, and Firestone Rubber, the biggest rubber producer, got together and conspired to destroy a very efficient electric rail system that was working in Los Angeles. So they bought it up and destroyed it because they wanted people to use automobiles for obvious reasons. Well, that was a conspiracy. They were brought to court and condemned. I think they were fined something like $5,000 or something on that order, about enough for the pleasant dinner they spent celebrating their defeat. And that led to the elimination of the public transportation system, highly efficient public transportation system in Los Angeles, which is, the automobile capital of the world. And the same happened throughout the country. So New England was, where I live, was tied together through electric railways the early part of the century. All of that's gone. You want to survive, you have two cars. That's not consumer choice. In the 1950s, the government, the Eisenhower administration, inaugurated what they call the National Defense Highway System. If you want to organize a public subsidy to big industry, you always have to put in the word defense. Okay, That's the cover. Makes people willing to pay for it. So there was a national defense highway system. The justification was you'd have to move missiles around in case the United States was attacked by Cuba or somebody. No, not Cuba in those days, somebody else. But of course the reason was to try to shift transport from rail to highway, trucking and private automobiles. Again, for the obvious reasons. These are the major industrial sectors of the economy. They just need massive public subsidy. So the National Defense Highway System was developed at a huge cost, and it was recognized publicly, in fact, not big headlines, but in congressional testimony and so on, that this was a kind of a Keynesian stimulus to the economy. Government stimulus to the economy. When they talk about government stimulus, that means public stimulus. After all, government is what you pay. Going off to the advanced sectors of industry and ending up with, that's a major factor. This was connected with local states developing similar projects, real estate interests, and so on. That led to the suburbanization of America. A major social engineering project, which has changed everything, changed ways of life, shopping malls, broke up cities, changed patterns of living, attitudes. It's just a very radical change in the nature of the society, which is state social engineering. Consumer choice had very little to do with it. At the same time, the railroads were effectively destroyed except for freight. That's efficient. Transporting people is not efficient. They have to breathe, and they take up too much space, and so on and so forth. But freight is fine. So there's a freight transport system, but essentially no rail transport system. And in fact, mass transportation in general deteriorates radically and is very costly. It's designed to be costly in a regressive fashion. So if you look closely at the public transportation system, say in Boston, it turns out that a subway ride for a poor person in the downtown urban area to where they go to work is very profitable for the system. But a bus ride from to where I live, out in the suburbs, where the rich folk live, that turns out to be very costly to the system. So the prices are set in such a way that, first of all, to keep you away from the system if you can, but also to make sure that it's the poor who are paying for it. And this is done in all sorts of ways. That's a very standard technique for shifting the tax burden to the poorest parts of the population and enriching the wealthy, which is why you have enormous inequality, among the reasons for it. These things just don't happen because of laws of nature, and certainly not laws of the market, but by public policy decisions, or policy decisions in which the public basically has no part, because they don't know about it. They're made behind closed doors. The media don't tell you about it. You can find out about it in the parts of the scholarly literature, but not in textbooks, and so on. Furthermore, all of this is part of a much broader system, worth understanding. Go back a little bit in history. The Depression in the 1930s convinced business, anybody who still believed that capitalism might possibly work, and there weren't many, were disabused of that notion by the Depression. It was clear that the system was utterly unviable, and it was clear to everybody. It had been clear to most of business before. But the Depression was a serious blow. There were efforts to overcome the effects of the Depression through government programs, what were later called Keynesian programs, the New Deal. They didn't work. By 1939, the Depression was about as bad as it had been in 1932. Unemployment was about the same, and so on. Some of the harsher edges had been softened, but it was essentially the same. Then came the Second World War, which was a huge shot in the arm for U.S. industry. In fact, U.S. manufacturing roughly tripled during the Second World War. And the reason was it was essentially a command economy. Corporate executives flocked to Washington. They carried out intensive industrial planning, allocation, wage controls, theoretically price controls, but that was somewhat in the breach. But a well-organized state-coordinated economy, and it taught the lesson that you can overcome the market crises by massive state intervention. And it taught the lesson to exactly the people who had to learn it, namely the corporate executives who ran the system. After the war, the end of the war, it was widely assumed by the business press, by economists, general assumption that the country was going to head right back to depression once this state coordination and stimulus was taken away. And that's the background for the kinds of comments that I was quoting from the business press about how high-tech industry cannot survive in an unsubsidized, competitive, free market economy, and the government must be the savior. And there was much discussion about this in the late 40s, public discussion, in the business press and elsewhere. And it was recognized right away, an interesting discussion of it, that this state stimulus, what's now called Keynesian stimulus to the economy, could come in many different ways. For example, it could come through social spending, or it could come through military spending. And it would have essentially the same effect as you learn in your first-year economics class. It's probably true. Anyway, that was the assumption of the business world, who were the only ones talking about this then, and economists. They made a quick decision that military spending would be better, not on economic grounds, but on other grounds, on grounds of power, basically. There's a problem with social spending, like hospitals and schools and that sort of thing. One problem is that it has a democratizing effect. So people are interested. You're building a school somewhere, people have an opinion about where it should be and what it should be like, and so on and so forth. And that generally tends to engage the population in the political system, which is a bad thing. We've got to prevent that. On the other hand, military spending doesn't have that bad effect. So nobody has an opinion on what kind of a jet plane you should build. Some guy in the Pentagon tells you. Furthermore, social spending has a redistributive effect. It tends to shift wealth towards the general population. Military spending concentrates wealth in the hands of high-tech industry. And another thing is military spending is easy to sell if you can frighten the population. As Senator Vandenberg put it, we have to scare hell out of the people in order to ensure that all of this can work. This is very conscious. Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, informed Congress that the word you have to use is security, not subsidy. Of course, it's a subsidy, but you use the word security. That way people will be adequately frightened. And it was a major effort to frighten people. It continues, all sorts of horrors. If it's not the Russians, it's Hispanic narco-traffickers or Libyan terrorists trying to, kill the president or something like that. They actually had tanks surrounding the White House to prevent Libyan hitmen from killing Reagan. Criminals, black by implication, black criminals, and so on. You got to keep the population frightened. That's a large part of the job of the media and intellectuals and so on. And you have to sell them on security, not subsidy. That way you can carry out subsidy in the efficient fashion through the military system, which concentrates wealth and undermines democracy. And that's the way it continues. Part of the reason why the Pentagon budget stays at Cold War levels and in fact is now increasing under pressure from the so-called conservatives who understand the system very well. Well, this covers just about every dynamic part of the economy. It's not just aircraft. So the reason you have computers and electronics generally and automation, pharmaceutical industry, biotechnology, just run through the list. Information technology, the internet, take transistors. I mean, just pick what you like. If you look at it closely, it's initiated, funded, subsidized through the costly period, the development period, through public spending. And then, if it ever turns out to be profitable, it's handed over to so-called private enterprise. The internet is, in fact, a dramatic example. It was developed in the Pentagon, run there for 20 or 30 years, then handed over to the National Science Foundation and the public universities. Finally, in 1995, just very recently, it was commercialized, meaning handed over to Bill Gates and people like that, who at least you have to admire sometimes for their honesty. Gates, for example, has pointed out that he's attributed his success to his ability to embrace and enhance the ideas of others, mostly from the public sector, which is correct. And that's, in fact, the way the economy works. And it goes way back. It goes back to textiles and steel and everything else. And in fact, every other successful economy works the same way. New Zealand is unusual in that it's actually believed the official ideology, or chosen to believe it, and is following the path that was imposed by force on the third world, namely, they have been forced to follow free market rules. And that's a good part of the reason why India is India and England is, or was, England. Pre-Thatcher, England was England. Well, that's the history of, these are things that we can understand. I mean, maybe it's not all the economic theory isn't entirely clear, but the facts are reasonably clear, and you can draw your own conclusions from them. The United States also, still keeping to the United States, has happens to have an extremely violent labor history. It's an unusually free country in many respects, but a very violent country, and by comparative standards, and comparative, that is, to the industrial societies. The labor history is particularly violent. So hundreds and hundreds of American workers were being murdered by security forces at a time when that was just totally unknown in Europe. I mean, even in very reactionary societies. By the 1920s, it appeared that there was a lot of glee about the end of history, utopia of the masters. The labor movement had been totally destroyed, mostly by violence, and business was running everything. It looked as if everything was under control. Workers were totally intimidated. Huge stock market, going through the roof. In fact, kind of an extreme version of what's being praised today. Well, then came the 1930s, economic collapse, revitalization of popular forces, rapid revitalization, because even when they seem to be destroyed, they're sitting there right below the surface, ready to get going again. And they did. The labor organizing was militant and successful, and other popular movements developed, and they essentially forced the government to grant the kinds of rights that had long existed in other industrial societies. So the right to organize, some minimal form of security, and so on and so forth. That's the New Deal. And that became frightening. It became near revolutionary. The sit-down, you have to remember, a sit-down strike, which was what was taking place then, a sit-down strike is just one step short of taking over the industry and placing it under worker control, which is a radical change in the nature of the social system. And it doesn't take long for people to figure out, well, we know how to run this factory. Why let the managers boss us around and give the owners the profit? That's an extremely small move. Sit-down strikes were getting there. The ideas were around. It's a move that, at least in my opinion, ought to take place, but it came very close to taking place at that time. And that frightened business no end. If you read the business literature at the time, they were very frightened. They warned of what they called the hazard facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses, which was threatening traditional business rule. There was a counteroffensive that started off right away in the late 30s. It was put on hold by the war, by the Second World War, which had other priorities. But it was picked up immediately after the war. There were immediate legislative efforts to cut back the rights of labor. They started in the late 40s. They've been continuing since. And there was also a kind of an innovation. Business recognized that they could no longer control the workforce by violence. And it was therefore going to be necessary to turn far more to techniques of propaganda. There's a huge public relations industry in the United States. It is dedicated to what it calls controlling the public mind, regimenting the minds of men as just as an army regiments their bodies. I'm quoting from PR manuals. That's what they were going to do. After the Second World War, there were calls in the top business world for fighting the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinating people with the capitalist story until they can repeat it by rote and so on and so forth. Major campaign which targeted everybody. Captive audiences in factories were compelled to, submit to this propaganda, got into the schools, including the elementary schools, the universities, of course, the churches, even the sports leagues. Everything was targeted. It was an enormous campaign, and it had some kind of effect. The United States was basically a social democratic country in the popular attitudes in the late 40s. Within about 10 years, it looked as if that had been controlled again. And by the end of the 50s, people were talking again about the end of ideology. Things are under control, look passive and quiescent. Okay, then came the 60s. Everything blew up, massive changes, very constructive changes, I think. It led to a really substantial change in American society. Not institutional, that didn't change, but in attitudes and awareness and understanding of and implementation of human and civil rights. So women's rights, for example, rights of minorities, respect for other cultures, opposition to aggression and terror, in the environmental movement. All of these things grew out of this, major changes. That, of course, set off a counteroffensive again right away. And in fact, what's called neoliberalism is just a part of that counteroffensive. It's part of the effort to undermine democracy and the welfare state, the social contract. Another phase in the same battle that's been going on and on. And it's pretty straightforward. The neoliberalism, as it's called, economic rationalism, it's given different names. There's nothing new about it. It's an old policy. It was imposed by the British on India in the late 18th century and afterwards, and on the colonies generally. So it's not neo, it's certainly not liberalism, because the rich and the powerful insist on a powerful state that will foster their interests. That's extreme. And let me say, under Reagan, for example, state power vastly increased, along with protection and subsidy and bailouts and so on. Take a look at the last budget. It was just passed a couple months ago. And notice that the so-called conservatives, the House Majority Leader at that time, House Majority Leader Newt Gingrich, and the Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, who are full of impassioned rhetoric about how 7-year-old children have to learn responsibility and get off of the cycle of dependency and so on. They continued to hold the record, which they always hold, for government subsidies to their own rich constituents. So Gingrich has been in the lead for years, and Lott joined him this year, and that's typical. They all understand that the rich have to be subsidized and protected. That's the purpose of the nanny state. They have to be kept on their cycle of dependency. It's poor women with young children who have to learn the harsh lessons of the market, and that extends to the third world. They're all poor women with children, except for the rich elite that works for the masters. That's a good part of the structure of the world, and a good deal of the violence of modern history is the effort to impose those structures by force if people don't accept them. There are occasional exceptions, rare exceptions, where they're adopted voluntarily. New Zealand's an example. But typically it's by force. And the nanny state remains. In fact, if you look at the OECD countries, the rich countries, the state has grown relative to GNP during the period of so-called minimization of the state. It's not minimization of the state, it's a shift of the state from some degree of response to public needs to more concentration on the needs of private power. And the market is mostly a joke for lots of reasons. Well, the big change, I'll end with this, the big change that took place in the modern period, the post-World War II period, was around 25 years ago. There was an international economic order that was established at the end of the Second World War, what was called the Bretton Woods system, established by the United States and Britain. It did try to liberalize trade. They were hoping to get international trade had dropped very sharply between the two wars. And they wanted to get it back to roughly what it was before the First World War. That's pretty much what's happened. I mean, what's called globalization is actually in many ways a return to the pre-World War I period in terms of ratio of trade to global economy, investment flow relative to global economy, and so on. There are changes, but by gross measures, it's not all that new. In fact, in many ways, less than before the Second World War. So one effort was to liberalize trade, increase trade, to move towards some kind of what's called free trade. But another part of Bretton Woods, a crucial part of it, was to regulate capital flow, to make sure that capital flow was controlled. So countries were permitted, in fact encouraged, to maintain controls on export or import of capital, and the exchange rates were to be fixed. So the financial system was to be regulated and controlled. The trade system was to be liberalized. And those two things went together on the theory, which is plausible, though like most of economics, kind of guesswork, but at least plausible that liberalization of finance would undermine liberalization of trade. That was part of the reason. There was a general consensus on that. The other reason was a truism. It was understood by everyone and explicitly articulated by the framers of Bretton Woods, and in fact obvious on 2 minutes thought, that liberalization of finance undermines democracy and the welfare state almost automatically. And the reason is that the threat of capital flight is sufficient to undermine social programs. So if a country undertakes, say, programs to stimulate the economy or spend money on education and welfare, or in fact do anything which is called irrational, namely helps the population, not just profits. So if you do anything irrational like that, capital can flow out of the country. Well, capital flows out of the country, interest rates go up, economic growth drops, you have to stop spending, you end up in recession. In fact, that's exactly the IMF prescriptions for every poor country, if you notice them. And of course, what happens is what you expect. So capital flight, the possibility of capital flight gives financial institutions, which are highly concentrated, gives them the power to determine social policy everywhere, just by the threat of capital flight. Therefore, capital controls are necessary, and if you're going to preserve some degree of democracy and also social welfare. Well, I'm virtually paraphrasing what was said by the framers of Bretton Woods quite openly, and it's kind of obvious. I mean, the logic is straightforward, and it wasn't controversial then, and it isn't controversial now. Well, capital flight was liberalized in the early 1970s. The Bretton Woods system was dismantled in the early 1970s. The system can only survive as a cooperative system. So one in Malaysia is trying to control capital, but it'll never work because you have to have cooperation at the other end. You have to, both sides have to be participating. And if any major financial power pulls out of the system, it quickly erodes. Well, the United States pulled out of it in the early 70s, followed by Britain and Switzerland and other major financial centers, and the system was gone. By the 1980s, the rich countries had dropped regulation of capital. Others either joined or were forced to join. The East Asian countries, like, say, especially South Korea, which is a dramatic case, which had a miraculous economic growth unparalleled in history, was compelled to drop capital controls in 1993. That led to a huge inflow of speculative capital, then quick outflow of speculative capital. That's the East Asian crisis, particularly striking in countries like South Korea, which really had a strong economy and might recover it if they were some rational world order reestablished. And it had plenty of other consequences too. there was an astronomical increase in speculative capital. I mean, it just, the numbers are staggering right after the decline of controls, and it's mostly speculative capital. It's now estimated at over $1 trillion a day, maybe $1.5 trillion a day, most of it extremely short-term speculation. So, money goes in and back in less than a week for about 80% of it. A lot of it's hours or minutes. All of this is very harmful to the real economy. It's certainly not beneficial to it. And that's most of the foreign exchange transactions. In fact, probably about 95% of them by now. Maybe 5% are related to trade and investment. You go back to the Bretton Woods period, pre-1970, about 90% of exchange transactions were related to real economy, and maybe 10% were speculative. That's an enormous change, quite apart from the scale, which has exploded. And there are plenty of other effects, exactly the ones you'd predict. Since 1970, growth rates have declined. Productivity has declined throughout the wealthy countries. For the third world, it's been mostly a disaster. Incomes have stagnated or declined. In the United States, for example, about 80% of the population of the workforce is working longer hours under worse conditions, either to maintain, they haven't yet recovered their income level of 1973, not even 1989, in fact. And the same as in England, and to a lesser extent, but somewhat in the other industrial countries. There's been a vast growth in inequality. It's back to the 1920s. Been a very sharp rise in imprisonment. There's a superfluous population. You've got to get rid of them somehow, so throwing them into prison, mostly black males, that rate has gone up very, very fast. Tripled in the Reagan years, still going up fast. Health and education and welfare are deteriorating. In fact, profits are going through the roof, or they were until the middle of this year. In the middle of this year, the fairy tale economy, as it's called, which was a fairy tale for a few percent of the population, that finally began to, the crises began to hit the rich and the privileged. So it made the front pages. Now it's a front page story that the global economy is in trouble, because it's not just the 80% of the population who've been suffering from it in the rich countries and even more elsewhere, but it's also the top few percent who are benefiting from it. They're facing problems. Markets are extremely volatile and unpredictable. Financial markets, nobody understands. They're governed by what's called panics, manias, and crashes in the international economics literature, and they're all totally unpredictable. Nobody knows what's going on. And that's now threatening the rich. They're afraid of a global meltdown that'll hurt them as well. So there now are calls for reinstitution of Bretton Woods, re-regulation of capital, and they're coming from the most conservative sectors. So the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, which is, the rich men, the bankers' bank, basically. It's the bank of the central bankers, the most conservative institution you can find, has been calling for it, has also been warning that one should have humility in discussing international economic affairs. It's their term. You should have humility because nobody has an idea about what's going on. It's totally out of control, as they recognize, and now dangerous because it's threatening rich people. So you see it on the front pages. Well, there's nothing, as I say, in the third world it's mostly disastrous. And it is as well for most of the population at home. In the United States, it's remarkable. I mean, there's all this talk about a fairy tale economy, but if you take a look at it, the top, say, few percent of the population have been doing fantastically well. If you get the top 10% in income, sort of getting by, when you get to the next 10%, the 80th to 90th percent, they've actually lost net wealth during the fairy tale economy, meaning that debts have grown faster than assets. And when you get down below the top, the 80th percentile, it's mostly racing to try to stay even if you possibly can. That's the great Goldilocks economy that everyone's talking about. It's also the slowest recovery in U.S. economic history, and unprecedented in that it's left out most of the population. And the reasons are understood. So the reasons are understood to be what Alan Greenspan calls greater worker insecurity. Workers are intimidated. They're afraid that jobs will be transferred. The unions have been destroyed by simply refusing to enforce the laws. And that makes workers insecure, so they don't ask for raises, and that improves the health of the economy, gives you a fairy tale economy for the people who count. Now, they happen to be the ones who are writing the articles, which is why you read about it, but it's not true of the population. And now, as I say, it's beginning to hit the rich, so there's a lot of concern about what to do. Well, there's nothing inevitable about all of this. These are not the results of economic laws or laws of nature or anything. They're political decisions, very specific decisions taken by groups that happen to have the power to impose their will through often non-governmental institutions like the international financial institutions and others, which carry out their work more or less in secret, or simply through corporate power. Corporations are tyrannies, private tyrannies, which are unaccountable to the public, which administer trade, so it's not free trade, and involved in all kind of alliances with one another and have enormous impact on state policy, obviously. Those decisions are leading to a certain form of globalization. It doesn't have to take that form. I mean, it could take other forms. The globalization is by no means out of control. You look at trade and investment flows and that sort of thing. The great majority is among countries which have parliamentary institutions, Europe, United States, and Japan, and they have no fear of a military coup, which means that in principle policies can be changed even within existing mechanisms. It's a matter of taking control of what's effectively, at least in principle, ought to be under your control. That requires understanding what's going on, of course, and breaking through the web of propaganda and secrecy and so on, but that's by no means impossible, especially for relatively privileged people. And in these societies, a large part of the population is relatively privileged and can do quite a lot about it and have choices. Furthermore, that's within the framework of existing institutions, and there's nothing holy about them. Institutions are not self-legitimizing. They have to face the test of legitimacy. That's true of kings and princes and slave owners and the Stalinist state and corporate structures or any other form of tyranny and domination. Has to prove that it's legitimate. And if it's not legitimate, it can be dismantled, exactly as has happened throughout history. That's why there's maybe agonizingly slow but definitely detectable progress in history, progress to a more humane world. And that hasn't ended. It's a matter of choice. If institutions have to be dismantled and modified and democratized, those are choices that are surely within the hands of the public, as they have always been in the past.